The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I apologize for the lateness in starting. We did have a series of votes, and we have a number of members who are on their way, so look forward to them joining us for this hearing. Our hearing this afternoon will explore U.S. policy responses to the growing trend of government incursions on the space for non-state actors in Sub-Saharan Africa. As authoritarian regimes and backsliding democracies have entrenched themselves in countries such as Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi, governments have increasingly encroached upon the mediating space between individuals and the state, particularly against religious groups and journalists, who often stand as independent institutional checks to authoritarian rule. Protecting the non-governmental sector in Sub-Saharan Africa is critical to preserving civil and political rights within the region. As we've learned from the United States civil rights movement, groups such as churches and independent journalists are often the safekeepers of civil liberties. Through sanctions and public diplomacy tools, the international community can protect the space for these safekeepers to operate in Sub-Saharan Africa. We can do it, and we must do it, and we must do it robustly. For example, the Catholic Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo is the only organization with a nationwide institutional presence and moral authority capable of checking Kabila's growing authoritarianism rule. The National Episcopal Conference of the Congo, or SENCO, is the only civil society institution that pressures the Kabila regime to respect human rights and democratic principles. SENCO mediated the St. Sylvester political agreement in 2016. It also oversees the Episcopal Commission for Justice and Peace, which conducts voter education, election observer training programs, and is a recipient of USAID funding and has expressed moral support for pro-democracy protests. The Catholic Church's leadership in the Congo does not come without a cost. Priests, nuns, and parishioners have been targeted, attacked, and killed in retaliation for that leadership. A few months ago, Father Sebastian Yebo, parish priest of St. Robert in an outer eastern suburb of Kinshasa, was abducted by the Congolese security forces. Interviewed on RFI radio, Father Joseph Bema of St. Kizito's parish said he has rarely slept at home since the brutal suppression of the protest marches organized by the Lay Coordination Committee on January 21st. The closing of space for faith-based organizations and other civil society organizations is indeed an extraordinarily worrying trend as a number of sub-Saharan African countries, within those countries. Humanitarian aid workers, journalists, priests, and political candidates and their families have been increasingly targeted and threatened by governments in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look north of the DRC, we can see that in South Sudan, a country that I have visited twice within the last 2 years, we see humanitarian organizations are harassed by government forces. Last year, humanitarian organizations reported over 700 cases of humanitarian access incidents. The environment for humanitarian operations grows increasingly difficult and dangerous as the geographic scope of humanitarian need continues to expand. South Sudan, shockingly, has today over 1.7 million IDPs. And of course, that's in addition to those who have made their way into Uganda. Ms. Bass and I actually went and visited the camp, Bidi camp, where many of those refugees were, and that number has swelled to close to 1 million. There's also growing concern throughout the region on the closing of independent objective media sources. Most recently, Burundi suspended Voice of America and BBC earlier this week for a period of 6 months, according to the announcement made at a press conference by CNC. The CNC claims that this suppression is in response to biased reporting. This suspension comes 2 weeks before the referendum allowing Burundi's president to serve into the 2030s. In an apparent violation of constitutional term limits, he's looking to extend, as we've seen this trend in many parts of the world, including in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. VOA's local correspondent told our U.S. Embassy people that the decision was a complete surprise, and we will hear more from VOA's Africa director as we kick off with our witnesses. All of our witnesses today bring us, the subcommittee, and by extension the Congress, on-the-ground perspective of the closing space for non-governmental organizations. And they will provide a snapshot of conditions in several countries. Their testimony will provide evidence of a growing regional trend of incursions into that space. My hope is that this hearing, and it'll be part of a series, will inform our view of possible U.S. policy responses to better protect fundamental civil and political rights in sub-Saharan Africa, which includes using sanctions, greater support for faith-based actors via USAID, and support for media independence, including Voice of America Africa. So I'd now like to introduce our distinguished witnesses, and again, we'll be joined by at least two of our subcommittee members momentarily. And with the indulgence of the witnesses, when they do come, I'd like to yield to them for any opening comments that they might have. Speaking on today of our first witness will be Ngugi Mengisha, the Africa Division Director of Voice of America. Mr. Mengisha has more than 30 years of experience with the Voice of America and has led the Africa Division since 2014. Previously, he was the Africa Division's program manager for 14 years, where he was instrumental in launching VOA programs in to Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Somalia, and Mali. He also served as chief of the Central Africa Services for 4 years and was chief of VOA's MURIC service for more than a decade. Before taking on his various leadership roles, he was a writer, reporter, and editor at VOA. Mr. Mengisha studied political science at Albertus Magnus University in Cologne and has practical training from the West German Broadcasting Corporation as well. We will then hear from John Pendergrast, and I would like to note parenthetically that the genesis of this hearing was a meeting that we had with him, and he brought some very startling and sobering facts to light during that meeting in my office, underscoring the need for this hearing and the recommendations he and the others I know will be making to this committee, to the Congress, and to the State Department and White House as well. John Prendergast is a human rights activist and New York Times best-selling author who has focused on peace in Africa for over 30 years. He is the founding director of Enough Project, an initiative to end genocide and crimes against humanity. He's also co-founder with George Clooney of The Sentry, a new investigative initiative chasing the assets of war criminals and their international facilitators. Mr. Pendergast has worked for the Clinton administration, the State Department, 2 members of Congress, National Intelligence Council. He can't hold a job, I'm kidding. He moves on to more and better things. UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, and International Crisis Group, and the U.S. Institute for Peace. He's got a very, very broad background and has made a huge contribution over the years. He serves as the executive director of the Not On Our Watch, founded by Matt Damon, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Don Cheadle. He appeared in the Warner Brothers motion picture The Good Lie, starring Reese Witherspoon. During his time in government, Mr. Prendergast was part of the facilitation team behind the successful 2-year mediation which ended the 1998-2000 war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and was part of the peace process for Burundi, led by Nelson Mandela, for Sudan, and for the Congo. He's been awarded 7 honorary doctorates, has been a visiting professor at more than a dozen prestigious universities, and he has been the subject of a number of high-profile media stories, and again has been recognized repeatedly and rightfully for his humanitarian work. Our third witness will be Stephen Harris, who serves as Policy Director for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Religion from Vanderbilt, Master of Divinity from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Master of Arts in Religion from Yale, and is currently a PhD student in the study of religion at Harvard. And having read his testimony, he makes a number of incisive recommendations that this committee needs to be looking at very, very carefully. Then we'll hear from Nanit, Talani, who is a human rights advocate and representative of the Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Coalition. Previously, she was an investigative journalist for Terre Africa, a French magazine. She has taught journalism and law at the Institute of Technique Professional and has traveled across her home country of the Congo to instruct community broadcasters. Additionally, she's the author of Kier and San Glont, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a poetry collection, holds a master's degree in journalism and a bachelor's degree in African literature. We welcome her to this hearing as well. Our fourth witness will be, thank you, Emerson Sykes, who is the legal advisor for the Africa programs at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, or ICNL, where he provides technical legal assistance and training to African civil society to improve the legal framework protecting the freedom of association, assembly, and expression. Since joining ICNL in 2013, Mr. Sykes has managed programs in more than 12 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and worked on the regional level with the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights. Previously, he was Assistant General Counsel to the New York City Council. He also served as Senior Policy Fellow in the Office of a Member of the Parliament in Ghana and researched U.S. foreign policy for the Century Foundation, a progressive think tank. Mr. Sykes holds a Juris Doctorate from the New York University School of Law, where he was a Root Tilden Kern Scholar and a Master's in Public Affairs from Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton. He also earned a bachelor's degree in political science at Stanford. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this hearing. Again, when the members do show up, we'll ask them if they have any opening comments, but I'd like to now go to our first very, very distinguished witness, Mr. Mengisha.
Chairman Smith, first of all, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also I'm very thankful for the opportunity to testify today. As you mentioned, I'm the Africa Division Director of Voice of America, which reports in 15 languages and reaches more than 68 African each week on television, radio, and digital platform. VOA is the largest of 5 media networks under the Broadcast Board of Governors and only BBG network in Sub-Saharan Africa. We connect the continent with the United States in accordance with the VOA Charter, but we also serve an additional purpose of providing Africans with an independent voice in media. Today, I'm going to focus my remarks on our work in Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world. I don't come to you as a policy expert or a diplomat. I'm a journalist and started my career in Ethiopia in 1966. I fled my country in 1980 because of political persecution, and I have seen the value of free press in times of political turmoil and conflict. Since 2015, more than 400,000 people have fled Burundi, and its capacity to support a free press is extremely weak. Voice of America's status as an international broadcaster has allowed it to remain independent, and editorial firewall granted by Congress has been critical to maintaining our credibility. In Burundi, Voice of America broadcasts on FM, shortwave, television, and on digital platforms. But FM radio is by far the most popular means. BBG owns FM radio transmitters, and through a country-to-country agreement, the government of Burundi provides access to their radio towers and a license to broadcast on certain frequencies. We currently have 2 local FM stations in Manga Hill and in Bujumbura. In December 2017, President Pierre Nkurunziza announced that he was calling for a referendum to amend the Constitution. If this referendum succeeds, he will be eligible to sit as president beyond 2030. He has been president since 2005. Last week, on Friday, one day after World Press Freedom Day, Voice of America was informed by the National Council of Commission, the government media regular body, that our broadcasts and BBCs would be suspended for 6 months, effective May 7 on Monday. Radio France was given a warning. This suspension comes 2 weeks before the referendum on May 17. It was a complete shock for all of us. BBG and VOA sprang into action to address the prospect of losing our FM stations and more than 3 million audience members. BBG Office of Technology, Service and Innovation arranged for extra short-wave broadcasts to accommodate new programming. VOA began to run frequent promos on our FM stations to educate listeners about short-wave alternatives. We added live shows over the weekend. VOA Director Amanda Bennett issued a public statement expressing dismay about CNC's decision. Our reporters also immediately jumped on the story. The Central Africa Service launched a new digital content transmission. On Friday, during Murisanga, this Kirundi word for a popular call-in radio show, we interviewed the legal advisor to CNC, who stated that the decision to suspend VOA was not final and could be appealed in court. His comments suggested that there may be a solution to the shutdown, and the BBG immediately engaged the State Department to seek diplomatic support. I would like to express my gratitude to the State Department, U.S. Embassy in Bujumbura, and Ambassador Ann Casper for their efforts to assist Voice of America. On Sunday, the chairman of the CNC also appeared on VOA Central Africa call-in show. The host of the show and other call-ins pushed back on his assertion for the decision. Unfortunately, the government followed through with its announcement. On Monday, our stringers throughout Burundi reported that VOA FM frequencies were suspended. BBG's technical monitors report that the shortwave signals are being received, although shortwave will never be as clear as FM, particularly in urban areas. We are committed to addressing the concerns of the government without sacrificing our editorial independence or journalistic standards. We are also watching this situation carefully for the safety of our journalists on the ground and their families. We have a contingency plan in place if need should arise. The closure of our FM stations in Burundi is a significant loss to the citizens of that country. VOA has a measured weekly audience of 57% of adults in Burundi. In Bujumbura, the weekly audience is 85%, one of the highest actually. The primary language for our audience is Kirundi, but we also have audience in Swahili, French, and English. All of these languages are affected by the suspension. But the greatest impact comes to Kirundi, which reaches 55% weekly, more than 3.2 million adults, primarily on FM radio. What's most impressive about this service, Central Africa service, is its level of trust in Burundi. 91% of its audience trusts the news and information VOA provides. For this reason, it's imperative that VOA continue to present accurate, balanced, and comprehensive news of information to Burundi. Our work is vital to providing a platform for civic engagement, maintaining the space for free speech, including civil political discourse, and supporting accountability, all fundamental tenets of an independent press. We are grateful for the support of Congress to the Voice of America, especially to VOA in Africa. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Mr. Mengisha, thank you so much for your testimony, for your leadership. We have been joined by Mr. Castro, serving as ranking member today. Any comments he might have, then I'll go to Dan Donovan. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. And I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being here and shedding some light for us on these critical issues. Today, human rights, civil liberties, including freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and rule of law, are constantly under threat in many parts of the world. Opposition party members, activists, and journalists are repeatedly harassed, intimidated, and sometimes jailed across sub-Saharan Africa and the world. Electoral commissions and courts are losing their independence as presidents stack them with individuals favorable only to them. Governments are regularly attempting to limit the activities of civil society by enacting laws criminalizing unregistered associational activities, imposing onerous registration requirements, and restricting access to foreign funding. It's now the norm for repressive and autocratic governments to shut down the internet in an effort to halt mass protests. This is an affront to the freedom of speech, the bedrock of democracy, and our values and principles as Americans. As these autocratic regimes entrench themselves, they increasingly crack down on civil society actors, especially the most vocal opposition groups. In some countries, It's democracy's activists and journalists who face the brunt of these repressive governments. In others, faith-based actors have emerged as the strongest voice for safeguarding civil liberties. We have experience with this in our own country. The church emerged as key during our own civil rights movement decades ago. We see the same in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the church is one of the strongest voices against democratic backsliding. This increasing crackdown on civil society shows us that our democratic gains are now under threat. Our message to these countries must be clear. Inclusive, open societies contribute to better democracies. I'm certain that some will see what's happening in the United States and question our own challenges today with democracy. Institutions in the United States remain strong and provide some checks and balances so that things don't just fall apart. We also see the President withdraw from our leadership role in the world, as evidenced by this administration's foreign policy that stepped away from our partnership with Africa. This was made clear when the President suggested a 26% cut to State Department and USAID to Congress earlier this year. Congress remains in solidarity with our partners in Africa and focused on U.S. political and economic engagement with the continent. We pushed back against the President's cuts and ensured that funding continues to go towards capacity building for civil society organizations, including those that work to defend human rights, strengthen independent media, and the rule of law. Congress remains committed to encouraging governments to respect their own constituents, their constitutions, and their people, and the fundamental freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses and the discussion today. Thank you, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan?
I also look forward to hearing from all witnesses, Mr. Chairman, so I'll yield all my time for the witnesses to have more time to testify and answer our questions. Thank you.
I'd like to now yield to John Prendergast for such time as he may consume.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the other members of the subcommittee. We're all very grateful for your ongoing commitment to human rights issues in Africa and throughout the world, as evidenced by your presence today and on your long-serving support for the issues that bring us together here today. Because my esteemed colleagues are covering a number of other issues related to the things we're covering today, I'd like to focus my time specifically on how to achieve the goals of this important hearing. So my focus is, my time is going to laser in on one aspect of the overall issue. The missing ingredient, I think, of the U.S. government's approach to countering repression in Africa and throughout the world, and that is how to build U.S. leverage needed to pressure leaders to stop brutally repressing basic freedoms of speech and assembly and religion. What possible levers of influence could the United States government utilize to support the goals of this critical hearing topic? So I'm going to skip down to the bolded section on network sanctions and add a personal confession. As a former diplomat and a reformed foreign policy expert, it took me decades to figure out what I'm going to tell you in the next 5 minutes. So let's start with something called network sanctions. Much, much more important than just using the term sanctions and utilizing the tool of sanctions. Why? Because those responsible for perpetrating conflict and targeting civil society in Africa have come to view sanctions as largely ineffective, an underwhelming challenge to their hold on power when only a handful of individuals, usually without ties to the international financial system, are the ones being sanctioned. The reason is that sanctions regimes focused on this region lack the necessary ingredients to make this tool effective. The idea that sanctions in Africa don't work is a product specifically of the design, the implementation of and enforcement of sanctions in Africa, not the tool itself. To be effective, sanctions have to be levied against entire networks that enable these authoritarian regimes to oppress civil society, not just the individuals that are committing the abuses. Deploying these network sanctions has been the strategy that the United States has used in Iran and North Korea and other places to drive them to the negotiating table. The strategy has been bipartisan. It's extended over the last 2 administrations, perhaps you can argue even further back, and consistently relied on leadership and direction from Congress, which is the key point. Congress has driven the train on these issues so many times. The United States has deployed extensive sanctions, as you all know, targeting Iran's leadership and military networks in an effort to disrupt the illicit funding streams used by the country's ruling elites to maintain their grip on Iran's government and economy. In 2 cases, and this is very important because, again, we're talking about what Congress can do, in 2 cases specifically using Executive Orders 13606 and 13628, these sanctions specifically focused on Iran's targeting of civil society. And I think these are important models to build from in order to ensure protection for civil society in sub-Saharan Africa. They're important models because they focus on networks. Sanctions that target full networks in this way are powerful tools for changing behavior and pressuring targeted individuals to alter their behavior or come to the negotiating table. Network sanctions work because they affect not only the primary individuals themselves, but also those who are acting on their behalf and the companies that they owned or controlled by these primary individuals. If you go after the individual, their networks, their companies, you sanction all of them at once or in close succession, an individual's network doesn't have enough time to absorb and adjust to the financial impact of being cut off from the U.S. financial system. And that is the precise outcome we're looking for. Shut them out of the international financial system. Try, if you have millions, if not billions of dollars in the international financial system, illicit gains in real estate, in banks, and shell companies, try to do business if you can't access the banks. You will not be able to do it. This is the key approach to driving and changing behavior. We believe network sanctions would have a dramatic impact on protecting civil society in countries in Africa. And all these countries specifically where interlocking kleptocratic networks involving political and military officials, their business allies, arms dealers, and international financial facilitators, particularly in the banks, they profit from mayhem and they obtain technology from commercial partners that allow them to suppress their own populations. The U.S. Department of the Treasury, as well as its counterparts in the European Union and elsewhere, can go much further than what we've gone so far, escalating the financial pressures against entire networks in sub-Saharan Africa and those around the world that support them. Again, Congress leads the way. And I won't belabor the point because you all know it, and you champion it, Congressman Smith, but the Global Magnitsky Act gives us an incredibly potent tool. Now, the administration is overwhelmed. There's all kinds of stuff going on. They've got now all these new efforts that are probably going to be taking place related to Iran. They need congressional support and push and pressure to ensure that we can utilize these incredibly potent tools that are not being utilized now sufficiently for our goals, our shared goals in Africa. Now, the second interlocking tool, because sanctions simply aren't, network sanctions aren't enough, the second interlocking tool in a sort of cocktail of more effective potential pressure and leverage that the United States could deploy in support of religious freedom and press freedom and individual freedom is the full range of anti-money laundering measures that are available to the United States government. The increasingly effective use of these AML measures to focus on corrupt and criminal regimes around the world that are also targeting civil society, we can use these AML measures in Africa, just as they've been used effectively in Iran and in North Korea and Burma and other places. Remember, when corrupt leaders or their business associates take bribes or they otherwise divert funds into their private accounts, then place those funds into the formal international banking system, usually in US dollars, which gives Treasury a direct connection and orbit, then that is money laundering. And our investigations and research have demonstrated that this is occurring across a number of countries in Africa. They route their money through neighboring countries and using US dollars and then into the international financial system. That means the US government can act. We have the authority. You can use public advisories to banks. You can request through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at Treasury, FinCEN, you can send requests from FinCEN to thousands of banks on specific targets of interest. This forces the banks suddenly to look at these issues that they otherwise have just no interest in. So again, if you're going to impose sanctions, but no one's looking to where the money's going through the international system, they're useless. This is what we've been doing. Don't do it. It makes us look like a paper tiger just to impose sanctions without then working with the banks who are the getaway cars for all this stolen money. And this then creates that leverage that if we went after the money and if the banks were our allies in doing that, bringing pressure to bear specifically on the people that are looting these states and repressing these people. What's Congress's role? Well, as I said already, in many cases, look, this says 10 years, go back as long as we've known each other, Congressman Smith, whether on Iran, Russia, North Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the most effective financial pressure measures have been imposed, have been pressured and pushed and brought forth by Congress. Congress, and in particular this committee, and this subcommittee of this committee, has been steadfast in its commitment to the people of countries like Sudan, like Congo, South Sudan, many others that you have mentioned in your opening statements. It's time to bring those two elements together: anti-money laundering measures, network sanctions, and ensure that critical legislation related to these countries, and we know that there is efforts afoot right now on Congo, and that's exciting to hear that the subcommittee and the committee are thinking about how they can move forward on a place like Congo, which is so fraught right now. Millions and millions of lives are at stake over what can happen in the coming year around this electoral process. So Congress getting early on on the train tracks before there's a collision is utterly critical. The Sentry, I'd like to just mention in my closing, is a piece of this. It's one of the initiatives that I'm working on. Even if you have new authorities, and even if you use these authorities, we still don't have within the U.S. government, because there's so much attention now, understandably, on Iran, on North Korea, on countering terrorism and drug trafficking, all the rest of it. What money is left to really do the kind of asset chasing, following the money of the resources that are being stolen and looted out of Africa by the same people that are repressing these folks in the countries we're talking about today? So we started an initiative that puts together a team of law enforcement folks, intelligence, investigative journalism, corporate security, policy experts, all jammed together, and we follow the money being looted from these resource-rich, war-torn countries in East and Central Africa. We haven't got the whole continent covered, but we're starting in the places where the conflicts are deepest. And we track where it ends up across the globe, because nobody's stuffing their money under their mattresses. They're putting it in the international banking system and buying real estate and setting up shell companies and all the rest of it, like everyone else does when they steal money around the world. So we're tracking that money, we're building dossiers, and we're turning that information over to the U.S. government, other governments around the world who can actually take action. And we're going to continue to do that, and we'd love to work more closely with this subcommittee to be able to make that happen. The bottom line is this: condemning words are fine. We had a condemnation yesterday from the White House on South Sudan. That's important to put the marker out there in words, right? But the issues that we're talking about today require serious action that impose serious consequences for the kind of actions that bring us together today in this hearing. Follow the illicit money. Those people that are looting the states are the same people that are committing these human rights abuses. That's their vulnerability. Go after it. We have not done that. Follow the illicit money, block it, freeze it, and seize it, and that will be the leverage to see improved human rights, at least from the U.S. government's perspective, improved human rights in Africa today. That's our view. Thank you very much for the time.
Mr. Prendergast, thank you so very much. I'd like to now yield to Ms. Talani.
I want to thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing today to give me the opportunity to discuss the lack of freedom and persecution of journalists in Sub-Saharan Africa by focusing on my country, the Republic of Congo, and my own story. I'm here today representing Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Coalition, or TASC. It's a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. It provides psychological and employment counseling, legal assistance for asylum seekers, and advocacy training to almost 300 survivors of torture every year. I have over 10 years of experience as a broadcaster, producer, investigative journalist, and human rights activist in Congo-Brazzaville. Like many countries in Africa, the Republic of Congo Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and press, but this right is only on paper. There is a widespread censorship of journalists and constant interference of government agents in the media, especially when journalists write about sensitive subjects. That freedom has deteriorated since President Denis Sassou Nguesso changed the constitution in 2015, removing age and term limit so he could govern indefinitely. Sassou Nguesso has ruled the country since 1979, except from 1992 to 1997. The majority of broadcast and print media in my country belong to the family members of Denis Sassou Nguesso or people who are close to him. Most journalists and editors engage in self-censorship to avoid being targeted by the government. Congolese journalists are basically two options: to praise and promote the ruling elite or keep quiet. If you want to be a true journalist, you risk threat at best or humiliation or death at worst. This is what happened to journalists Bruno Jacquet, Osebi, and Ellie Smith, because he's my former boss. They refused to engage in self-censorship. Osebi was burned to death in a suspicious fire in his home. And it was in 2009, after he wrote many stories exposing the corrupt practices in the Congo elite. In 2014, security forces invaded the home of Ellie Smith, robbed him, and gang raped his sister after he reported about government thugs attacking a gathering of opposition party members. Now I would like to share my own personal experience, just one. In 2014, I was working for the French-based media Terre Africa, and I wrote a story on ritual murders in the northern Congolese city of Weso. These murders take place in many African countries because people believe they can use victims' blood or organs to defeat their enemies, to become richer or more powerful. Murderers are often rich people who pay others to carry out the killings. My cameraman and I, we traveled to Weso to interview women who had survived attacks and family members of victims. But I got a tremendous satisfaction from my reporting on the subject because the mayor of Weso, he was arrested because he was suspected of being connected to the killings. My article and the gruesome photos that accompanied it put a stop to ritual murders in Congo. They did not spread in other parts of the country and become commonplace like in Liberia or other African countries. But harassment from the authorities after my report took an enormous toll on me psychologically. The government was very angry about my report because they thought that my reporting would tarnish Congo's image in the international community and among foreign donors. Police found the people I interviewed in Weso and criticized them for speaking with me. Then authorities called my boss and said I would be careful about sensitive subjects concerning like the corruption of the government. And one of my friends with connection to a secret government agent told me that my phone was being tapped. I was so afraid that I left my home to move in with cousin and some male relatives whom I think could protect me in case I was attacked. Other journalists in Congo were also being arrested at this time. But thankfully, the American Embassy, the European Union, and the United Nations told the Sassou Nguesso regime to leave journalists alone. So I think it worked. And that time, the US ambassador in my country was Stephanie Sullivan, now Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department Bureau of African Affairs. I really don't know what would happen if they didn't intervene. And when you are constantly afraid because you could be attacked, assaulted, raped, or even killed by people who will walk away with impunity, what kind of professionalism can you display as a journalist? What kind of daily life can you have? I'm sorry. This is what I and other journalists are facing in Congo. Fear of reporting the truth. Thank you. Okay. Fortunately, at the time, my emotional state was deteriorating. I won a Humphrey Fulbright Fellowship from the US State Department. I arrived here in 2015 and started working at the Voice of America when I was going to school at the same time. And I wrote a story about the government orchestrating the killings and civil war in Congo Pools region. I wrote a story to make that known, but the regime was angry with me, and they knew I was reporting the killings because I was working with the Voice of America. And after my story was published, and a lot of them also on election process, I couldn't go back home because one of my friends said, Nanit, I know you are very intelligent. I advise you not to return home. So now I was very terrified about what could happen to me. That's why I decided to apply for asylum in the United States. So today, even now, many opposition leaders have been imprisoned. Student leaders have been jailed and tortured. Corruption, abuse, and human rights and president in power for life are three of the major problems plaguing Africa. Congo has oil, and other African countries like DRC, Angola, or Cameroon are rich in minerals. But government officials, they are using these resources just to enrich themselves and their family members instead of building schools, hospitals, roads, or paying salaries of people. Governments routinely violate the human rights of minorities, women, journalists, and political dissidents. We need really a freedom and a freedom of association, of speech, so we can write about these issues. That is why I'm really proud to be an investigative journalist. I just hope that someday we have a press freedom in my country like you do in the US, because here journalists, they don't have to be afraid when they investigate or when they expose the truth. And that members of Congress can pressure Congo and other African governments to allow journalists to practice their profession without fear. Thank you very much for listening to my testimony today.
Ms. Delani, thank you so very much for your testimony and for your bravery in trying to get the story out about what's truly happening, particularly the ritual murders story that you just recounted to us. Thank you for that. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to join you today and certainly to be on this panel. Thank you again for your testimony as well. On behalf of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, I would like to express our gratitude for the ongoing efforts of this subcommittee to keep track of and to bring visibility to the vulnerable and the voiceless on the continent of Africa. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is the public policy arm, the nation's largest Protestant denomination, consistent with our focus on advocating for human dignity, religious liberty, the family, justice issues in the United States. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission advances the same agenda abroad, seeking to bring international awareness to human rights violations, religious persecution, and injustice around the globe. Given today's focus on the contracting civil society space in sub-Saharan Africa in general, and my topic on religious persecution in particular, I thought it appropriate to begin my testimony by laying bare the philosophical presuppositions that give legitimacy to a concern for religious freedom at all. In other words, why does it matter that we take into account the plight of religious communities in our overall analyses concerning both the state of certain African governments and the attending question of normalization with the same? Firstly, it cannot be rehearsed enough that the right to be religiously free, that is, to worship or not to worship according to the dictates of one's own conscience, is a right that stands at the heart of what it means to be human. Secondly, as we consider whether certain democratic ideals are taking root in a particular country, it is important to remember that the consent to be governed does not and ought not include state ownership over the conscience. When religious freedom is not protected, myriad human rights violations, various forms of violence, and overall destabilization is usually the result. This sentiment has been expressed already by officials in our current administration. Moreover, scholars have argued that one of the effects of civil society, religious community being a significant part thereof, is the checking of state power and the resisting of corrupt authoritarian rule and overall undemocratic impulses. Therefore, thirdly, the suppression of religious freedom can be correlated not only with safety concerns for the people of a given state, but also with broader global security concerns, including U.S. national security. With this ideological backdrop in mind, I will now devote the balance of my testimony to the status of religious minorities in Sudan. I would remind the members of the subcommittee that I have included in my written report information on the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, but I will speak about Sudan in particular with my commentary here today. I will conclude by offering a few principial suggestions for a relational pathway forward. In Sudan, the human rights record in general and religious freedom conditions in particular remains poor. President al-Bashir and his National Congress Party have been in power for a quarter century, and attending this rule, ongoing sites of repression, restriction, multifarious governmental attacks on civilians has been normative. In February of this year, it was reported that an evangelical church building in Khartoum was demolished on the charge of public disturbances. However, reports indicate that the land itself is desired for Muslim business interests. The 29-year-old church building belonged to the Sudan Presbyterian Evangelical Church and was one of 27 churches that the Sudanese government indicated would soon be demolished because of similar charges. 2 churches on this list were demolished in 2017, one being a Sudanese Church of Christ building, which served as the church's home to 300 members and the last Christian church in the region. Since 2014, the government has prohibited the construction of new church buildings. In addition to the destruction and confiscation of church property, government officials continue to harass and arrest church leaders. On April 4, 2017, a church elder, Mr. Yonan Abdullah, died after being stabbed during a raid of the Sudanese Presbyterian Evangelical Church School. Just last month, 4 Christians associated with the protests of the aforementioned raid faced new charges of physical harm to police, with reports of an additional 36 Christians associated with the church to stand trial in an unspecified date in the future. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom's 2018 report redesignated Sudan as a country of particular concern. Though the interim national constitution of Sudan includes religious freedom protections and recognizes Sudan as a multi-religious country, Article 5 essentially restricts freedom of religion by privileging Islamic Sharia law and popular consensus as a leading source of government legislation. Moreover, President al-Bashir has stated a desire that Sharia be codified as constitutional law. In light of the priority of Sharia law application, the Sudanese Criminal Code continues to uphold apostasy laws, making conversion from Islam punishable by death. The task set before this subcommittee and the broader congressional deliberative body is the accurate interpretation and assessment of these ongoing realities. Cited increased humanitarian access, counterterrorism efforts, and even the recent recognition of the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a legal religion all have occurred within a broader trend of human rights violations, toleration of extremists, and religious intolerance. An intolerance that was on full display even as the United States was reviewing the country's behavior in view of sanction reconsideration. We believe this trend reveals that the Sudanese regime's ideological commitments are perhaps incompatible with the requirements of a religiously tolerant state, and any United States action ought to be directed at these core commitments. Consistent with many of the recommendations of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, with its Sudan report in particular, we strongly urge that religious freedom be a serious factor taken into account as a foreign policy priority as the United States considers the nature of its relationship to Sudan and other African countries. Governmental structures and the ideologies that undergird them must be addressed. Religious freedom cannot be expected when it is concurrently undermined by constitutional order. Targeted tools and broad diplomacy efforts ought to be utilized in order to attain measurable improvements. With respect to Sudan in particular, we oppose the normalization of relations until a measurable impact on the ground for religious freedom and the health of civil society can be observed. There are discussions about removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terror lists, and we have significant concerns with this action absent a local improvement on human rights in general and religious liberty in particular. Thank you.
Mr. Harris, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Sykes.
Good afternoon, Honorable Chair Smith and esteemed members. It's my great honor to be with you today on behalf of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. At ICNL, we've worked with partners in civil society, government, and the diplomatic community in over 100 countries, including 20 nations in Africa, to improve laws relating to the freedoms of association, assembly, and expression. In line with ICNL's area of expertise, I'll focus on the first theme of this hearing, protecting civil society. I leave it to the other distinguished panelists to address specific issues related to faith-based actors and political speech, but I'll use the term civil society broadly to include non-governmental organizations, people's movements, and not-for-profit media. Why do we do this work? Because we've seen that people working together are capable of great things. From the struggle against apartheid in South Africa to preserving urban forests in Nairobi, from insisting on peace in war-ravaged Liberia to fighting disease and poverty throughout the continent, civil society has been at the front lines of positive change. Unfortunately, we're in the midst of a global trend of increasing legal restrictions on civil society. Since 2012, 72 governments have proposed or enacted 144 laws restricting civil society and the rights to freedom of association and assembly. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen at least 38 restrictive initiatives in 19 countries. The 4 countries that are the focus of this hearing, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda, have not been immune to this global trend. In Sudan, civil society organizations are regulated under the Voluntary and Humanitarian Work Act of 2006. According to this law, organizations must receive prior approval from the government before they can receive foreign funding. A 2013 policy explicitly limited foreign funding to humanitarian projects, prohibiting international support for human rights, environmental advocacy, or even economic development. Given that local funding for independent civil society groups is virtually non-existent, restrictions on foreign funding significantly impede the viability of these groups. In South Sudan, advocacy is not among the permissible objectives of civil society organizations, making it unclear what rules apply to organizations involved in advocacy activities. The government has broad authority to deny registration if an organization is involved in, quote, tribal and political differences in the country, end quote. In 2016, the government sent letters to several civil society organizations that are outspoken on policy issues, advising them that they should instead register as political parties. This type of enforcement action can have a chilling effect, discouraging organizations from participating in policy-making processes. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, freedom of assembly has been under threat as public protests related to the delayed presidential election have spread. The UN found that 47 protesters had been killed in the 13-month period ending January 31st, 2018. According to a 1999 decree, prior government authorization is required to hold a peaceful protest, even though this requirement is contradictory to international and regional law. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has issued guidelines on freedom of association and assembly in Africa and emphasized that, quote, participation in and organizing assemblies is a right and not a privilege, and thus its exercise does not require the authorization of the state. In Rwanda, the legal framework for civil society is relatively enabling, but in practice, the regulatory officials often impose additional requirements and restrictions that are not in the law. The government is currently drafting amendments to the 2012 laws governing local non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and faith-based organizations, and held consultations with all three constituencies. We hope that the concerns raised by civil society organizations will be incorporated into the final drafts of the bills before they are presented in Parliament. In the face of this negative trend, though, African civil society has shown great resilience and achieved some important victories. In 2014, the Parliament of Kenya sought to introduce a 15% cap on foreign funding for civil society organizations. This funding restriction would have decimated the sector. In response, civil society activists formed a broad and well-organized advocacy coalition against the proposed amendments and strategically partnered with the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi and other diplomatic missions to pressure the government of Kenya to change course. Eventually, the amendments were withdrawn. Just last week, Tanzanian civil society and independent media advocates successfully challenged the so-called bloggers fee in court. The Online Content Regulations 2018 require anyone posting information online to pay a fee of over $900 US. On May 5th, a court issued a preliminary injunction to prohibit the government from enforcing the fee. In conclusion, I humbly offer a few recommendations for how this committee can help support more of these kinds of victories. First, Congress should preserve funding to the State Department and USAID that help safeguard legal space for civil society in Africa. Second, Congress should conduct oversight of federal agencies and departments, including those involved with counterterrorism, national security, anti-money laundering, defense, and international trade, to assess the extent to which different parts of the government are supporting or undermining the legal space for civil society. Third, Congress should continue to engage directly with civil society through hearings such as this one and ensure that laws and policies support civil society and philanthropy in the United States and internationally. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify and for its interest in these important issues.
Mr. Sykes, thank you very, very much for your testimony and your leadership. I'd like to begin the questioning, and I'll kind of, because we have a full complement of members today, and we do have votes around 4 o'clock, I'll ask most of my questions right up front, please, if you wouldn't mind jotting them down or just answering them as you would like. One overarching concern that I have had, I have worked human rights issues in China since I've been in Congress. I've been in since 1981. I chair the China Commission along with Marco Rubio. We've had multiple hearings. We've had them in this subcommittee as well about China's growing influence in Africa, which portends, I believe, bad governance and a whole lot of other misdeeds. There's no Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, in China, so the buying and selling of business contracts can become even more commonplace than they already are. But on point with what we're talking about here, we have documented in the China Commission that the NGO law that was passed by Xi Jinping, passed by a rubber stamp parliament, People's Congress, just crushes NGOs, ends almost completely any kind of outside funding or collaboration with those NGOs. And they've done the same thing with religion, as Xi Jinping seeks to crush religion. And I, for one, and I'm sure it's shared by many of our people on the panel, are concerned about China's bad governance model, which assures that those in power, the elites, are able to do as they will with very little fear of being held to account, because that's the way they do it in Beijing. So if you could speak to NGOs and the crushing of religion, this idea of no affiliations, if you'd like, any of our panelists. Secondly, Mr. Mengisha, I was wondering, I worked on a case out of Baku, Azerbaijan. Had been there twice, met with Aliyev, the president, there. And there was a Radio Free Europe reporter, an indigenous reporter who was a good, solid member of the team, who got 7.5 years for exposing the corruption of Aliyev and his family. I met with her. We held hearings on her. We introduced a bill. The head of Radio Free Europe came and testified on her behalf, and she got out of prison. It sent a message, one person, it's still one person. Some other journalists and others got out as well, because we have pushed that she is a microcosm of a larger issue in much the same way as Ms. Talani. You talk about, one person, yourself, who was bullied because of your reporting on ritual killings. And I'm wondering, if you will, Mr. Mengisha, are there any VOA reporters or any reporters that work with your service that are imprisoned? Are there any of their families that have been bullied, roughed up? And of course, there's a peership, there's a common bond with all the other journalists, which I know they feel. Are they able to speak out on behalf of the other journalists, as Ms. Talani talked about? Even when there's a visit of a opposition party leader, the journalists are beaten up. I mean, that is absurd. They're there to cover and to do reports, and they get their faces crushed. So if you could speak to that about, and secondly, what more can we do? Again, Ms. Talani talked about how Ambassador Stephanie Sullivan, stepped in, as did a few other diplomats, that really helped you, protected you when you broke that horrific story about ritual killings. So the question, I know there's self-censorship, and you talked about that. You might want to elaborate on that if you would. But the idea of a sustained effort to say, from our government, other free countries, the AU itself ought to be, they have a human rights treaty, a compact. Where's the implementation when it comes to journalists and civil society? Are they on the scene doing the work, if you could? I'd asked John Prendergast, if you would. Thank you for your work about network sanctions. I think that's transformational, especially what the Century Project is doing. You pointed out in your testimony that there is little risk of getting caught because there's too few resources devoted to little personnel and resources by us, the U.S. government, and by European governments. What kind of build-out would there need to be on our, you're conveying actionable information. What are they doing with it? And we will have a hearing with the administration. That'll be our next step in this series on this very issue. What do they do? You give them something. Do they act on it? Do they say, we'll look into it, and then nothing happens? And what kind of resources do you think need to be brought to bear, if you would, to make a difference? Let me ask, I have other questions for you, but after my colleagues speak, I'll get back to those. Mr. Harris, you had devastating information about each of the countries in question. Sudan, you elaborated on. But you also pointed out that 700 churches have been closed in Rwanda. We've had a couple of hearings on Rwanda and the human rights abuses, the extrajudicial killings ordered by its president, we believe. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that as well. It's easy to give a pretext, they're just not sanitary, too much noise, whatever it might be. But it seems to be, when you get up to 700 churches, there seems to be a major problem there. And CPC designation, my hope is, I'm the author of the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, which gave additional tools to the Office of Religious Freedom, including Sam Brownback, our ambassador at large. I was with him last night. He is all into the whole of government approach, that you get religious freedom right, you're more likely to have other civil society actors better treated, and a democracy that's more likely to flourish, if you might want to speak to that as well. And again, as you pointed out, in Sudan, since 2014, government has prohibited the construction of new church buildings. So not only are some being torn down and taken over and used for other purposes, they're not allowing in that country even that they be built. And I do have other questions, but again, in interest of my colleagues, I'll come back to those. So if you could maybe perhaps address some of those.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Our journalists actually consistently are under threat. A case in point is, for instance, about a few months ago, we lost a reporter in Mogadishu. He was a cameraman. He worked with another stringer. Actually, he was killed by Al-Shabaab's attack in Somalia. And actually, his name is Ali Nur Said. A week ago, just on the May 3rd, on the commemorating the Free Press Day, actually, the dedication ceremony was done in the VOA by BBG. Joel Lansing actually made the dedication ceremony. So that happened. Actually, so if you take Somalia in the last 20 years, over 64 journalists have been killed. I'm just giving you the worst scenario. Take Burundi, the one I just told. In the last year alone, we have actually removed 5 journalists from Burundi, Bujumbura, because they were under threat. In fact, one of them I have here, Dan, maybe she can, over there. Her house was bombed by grenade. Luckily, no family member was there. The next day, I think with the help of State Department, Freedom House, we actually moved her to Kigali. And she came here as a fellowship. Now she works with us as a contract employee with the Voice of America. That's in case. Total of 5 have been removed. I mean, if you take across the continent, to be honest, Ethiopia, my home country itself, so many journalists have been in jail. Now, most of them have been released. Actually, one arrived here, he's in town. Iskender, by the name Iskender, a blogger. Kenya has a problem by itself. Zimbabwe is a good case, actually, to be honest. We have a program there. We have about 19 stringers. During Mugabe's time, there was a constant harassment. People have been thrown to jail also. So that, I think these are some examples. We can also give you on the record, actually, more information on that. When I go back to the office, we can give that to you later, actually. You have mentioned China, actually. I would talk, I think, China regarding NGOs and religion suppression. I think the other experts can talk about it. In terms of media, actually, we are facing really big difficulty because of China's involvement. They actually train and also equipped jamming, for instance. Ethiopia used to jam our broadcast from the Horn of Africa in Amharic and Afan Oromo. For the last many months, actually, they have stopped jamming now. I think the jammers have been trained in China, and the jamming equipment have been given by China. The same thing has happened also in Zimbabwe during Mugabe's period also. China plays a significant role. They are actually really a big offensive in terms of trying to capture the media environment in Africa. They train journalists. Actually, they have started programs in Swahili, English, French, Hausa. They might add more. I hear that they have a total of 65 languages reaching the world. I think some of them very important languages in Africa. Actually, we have taken that very seriously, and we have sent a reporter and a cameraman to Kenya to assess the impact of China on the continent. We took Kenya as an example because they built the railway station Mombasa to Nairobi. Plus also they play significant role actually in China. They broadcast in Swahili, actually on the government radio stations. So that's the thing that we're closely following.
Just on that same point, does that also apply to the internet surveillance that the Chinese have perfected?
Yeah,
they conveyed those repression technologies.
We get, to be honest, we get constantly blocked whenever there is civil unrest, when there is election. Ethiopia has done it. Angola has done that. Zimbabwe used to do that. I think I can't really verify that whether they have a direct hand. I think the experts should talk about it. But there is, I think, blockade of internet throughout the continent, actually.
Thank you. Mr. Prendergast.
So 2 quick things. One is on the way that the U.S. government responds to the information that we give them from the Sentry. We've, over the last 2 administrations near the end, we've just started sort of a couple of years ago, so near the end of the last administration, and now year and a quarter or whatever it's been from the new administration, great deal of interest across departments, led by the Treasury Department. And we create these dossiers in the form that dossiers are used in the U.S. government. So we have a number of people who worked in Treasury, worked at State, worked at the NSC, so they know what kind of information you need and what kind of legal vetting needs to have been done before you can actually make the case for imposing sanctions on a particular person. So that's the kind of dossier we create. Now the problem is, and so far, they've acted on a number of things. The problem is resources, like it is everywhere. But it's very small amounts of money could go incredibly far. This now is the central instrument of U.S. foreign policy to leverage change related to democracy, human rights, counterterrorism, countering nuclear proliferation. The sanctions and money laundering efforts, anti-money laundering efforts are central to U.S. projection of power. And you can understand that Africa's at the bottom of the priority list. And so in the context of the appropriations process, there is a request from the appropriations to enhance by $3.25 million, not billion, $million. Very small amount relative to the larger picture, not saying that this is peanuts, but to help support OFAC, the people who do the sanctions, and FinCEN, the people who do the AML work, to help build their capacity to carry out their work. So I think that if this subcommittee were supportive of that, that would be really useful politically as the process goes forward. And just a quick point on China.
And that would be enough, or that would be a start? I mean, should we be asking for more? That's not much.
They've made an assessment
Yeah.
that in order to be able to do, I mean, it's not going to be all that they need to be able to deal with all of the kinds of issues that all of us around the world want to see the United States government working on related to human rights and democracy promotion and religious freedom and all the other issues that would motivate. But it's a start in enhancing that capacity to be able to do work. And we'll provide more information about where that is in the process and connect you to the right people. Just one point on the China issue, you know, it's clear that we had decades, I think, one could argue, Africanists would argue, Africans would argue, the trend line was increasingly positive with respect to democracy, the growth of democracy and protection of human rights on the continent over the course of from the 2000s through the early part of this decade. We've seen a real pullback. And often when our diplomats, when U.S. diplomats go in to speak with their counterparts in Africa, the African governments will just say, well, we're glad, if you're going to press us on these democracy issues, if you're going to press us on these human rights issues and religious freedom, we're just going to turn to China because they don't make, you know, these same demands. Okay, that's a given, that's a reality. I don't see us changing that piece of it. However, what we can change is the leverage we bring. So when you sit down in a room and have those meetings with leaders, and you're not bringing any leverage to the table, you're just saying, gee, isn't human rights and democracy in your interest? They're like, actually, probably not, because our interest is looting the state and staying in power. So our words and our ideals are not enough. They may have been in the past, they're not now. But the financial leverage we have, because most of these governments are using the international financial system and moving money in dollars, the leverage that we have is far greater than China. If we use that leverage and target these individuals, I'm not talking about the kind of sanctions that existed in Sudan in the 90s and 2000s where you sanction a whole country. No, you focus in on those people who are most responsible at the top of the chain for the destruction of their countries, for the looting of their countries. You build out a case, an understanding of their financial networks, and you go after that vulnerability. Then you go in and have a meeting with them, and they're not saying we're going to run to China because they can't, because now all their real estate in Europe and in Australia and North America, wherever they've been hiding all their assets, is potentially now locked up. And all of the people they've been working through, the cutouts, and a lot of these rulers use their children as the owners of the companies that own the real estate in the United States and Europe and other places. Once you start going after that, then they're going to start talking to you. So again, it's about building leverage for human rights, for the promotion of democracy, for the promotion of religious freedom.
Thank you again. I want to say before that my report on ritual murders is only one of the reports I did. I did a lot of them, and so all of my reports were exposing the violation of human rights or the killings of people or everything which need to be fixed in my country, because I think the role of a journalist is to target the things that are not right in the country and to get them fixed. So when this happened to me, when the government really came to me and said, hey, you need to be careful, we don't want what you're doing. At the same time, the journalist, Ellie Smith, who was my boss, so I said he was attacked and his sister was gang raped. but also another journalist, Sadio Kante, she was expelled from the country, and Morgan Palmer, he was also expelled from the country. So I remember even I said, my boss from France, he asked me to do a report. It was on corruption. I said, no, I'm afraid I don't want to do that report. And he said, but I'm afraid too. And I said to him, you know, you're afraid, but what they can do to you is just to expel you from the country because you're French. But for me, since I'm a Congolese, I cannot even imagine what they are able to do. So the intervention of the US ambassador, Stephanie Sullivan, and the United Nations and the European Union came really on time, because a lot of things were going on the ground at the same time. So they heard about that, and they made a lot of pressure on my government. So if they didn't do anything, I think things would go like worse. And I remember that, you know, the US is really concerned about freedom of speech, of association, of human rights, the protection of human rights around the world. And they want my country to be like the US. So they're just doing what they can do. I remember one day we had a meeting of journalists from Congo at the US Embassy. They asked us what was going on, if we had some threats in my country. But I think nobody said anything, because we know that among us journalists, some have a connection with the police. If you say anything, they're going to report and you can get bad. So that day we didn't do anything. So I would like to say what the US can do if you want to protect journalists. In my country, for example, you don't have to gather all of them together, because we are very, very afraid of reporting the threat the threat we have from the government. So it's good, it's hard, but it's better to take journalists one by one, so we can feel free to expose what the government is doing to us. But really, I really appreciate everything the US government is doing to protect the rights in Africa and around the world.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your questions. I'll seek to answer them in turn. Certainly, if we conceive of religious freedom as this fundamental, inalienable right of the human conscience to decide of itself and for itself matters of faith or other religious deeply held beliefs, and then to attribute particular actions or animations that accord with those convictions, then certainly when we see efforts, as you mentioned, China's involvement on the continent to suppress religious freedom, not being in the best interest of the continent itself, a particular country of concern itself. Ironically, if we do concede the definitional understanding of religious freedom that I just laid out, the suppression of religion is itself a particular religious imposition, right? And so, however we regard China's involvement, and I recall the particular hearing most recently, perhaps provocatively used the term colonialism. I think it is attributable in this case. We want to make sure that we're being critical about how we're understanding a particular country's own self-interest, particularly as it relates to religion. And so that suppression in and of itself is an imposition of a particular religious ideal that undermines a sense of freedom and a sense of kind of self-worth and a sense of kind of self-ownership. And I would argue that this particular freedom, because of its nature, actually serves as the kind of cornerstone of the free society. And so whatever long-term interest we might regard or question even of China's involvement in the continent, certainly the suppression of religious freedom would undermine whatever those long-term benefits are that we would be hoping to see. On the question of Sudan in particular, I think that there's continuity here as well, particularly with the closing of churches and with the prohibition of further building, church building. It betrays a particular, again, understanding of religion and a particular religious ideology, which is why I think it's legitimate to question whether or not the governmental structure of the country is itself compatible with the ideal itself. And so we just want to encourage this deliberative body, as we're seeking to think about relationships with this country in particular and their own attestation of an affirmation of religious freedom, whether or not the particular practices on the ground actually bear that out. And so it is our sincere belief that if this particular freedom is not safeguarded, then the hopeful efforts that we would like to see, particularly with Sudan, are going to be short-lived. And so we would just encourage, as we think about our foreign policy initiatives, that this particular ideal on the ground with actual measurable results, and I think measuring the amount of church closures and perhaps the amount of churches that are allowed to be built is a measurable indicator, right? And if the answer to that is 0, then I think that speaks of a particular problem. Lastly, and I think, again, there's continuity across the board here on the question of Rwanda and the 700 church closures there. It's interesting. One of the commentators of that particular event actually said that the local church space, or perhaps religion in general, served as the last spaces where individuals could imagine a future that they themselves would like to see put in place, right? So these spaces are in many ways incubators of democratic ideals where, rooted in the convictions of the particular community, they imagine beyond perhaps the horizon of the current governmental structure. And that is threatening, that is deemed threatening. So similar to the issue that journalists are facing in other countries, I think it's similar there in Rwanda, a country that has seen remarkable economic development, but in many ways, it could be said, is experiencing an also ever-closing political space. I think it's an identification of these local churches, not because they're primarily political in their actions, but again, because they're ideators of particular visions of nation building that perhaps are critical of the particular governmental structure and power. And so how do you advance, or how do you close, rather, a political system? You certainly go after the spaces that are, again, kind of incubators of these democratic ideals, which these local churches in Rwanda do.
Before you conclude, and then I'll go to Mr. Sykes, when President Obama laid out 5 criteria that Bashir had to reach in order to have the sanctions lifted, human rights in general, religious freedom in particular, was not included. At the time, I and others said this is outrageous. How could you not have human rights as a benchmark for the lifting of those sanctions? As Mr. Prendergast knows, when we did these sanctions originally, human rights was at a core of what our concerns were. And I'm wondering now that we're seeing very, very poor consequences from that, and I would add predictable consequences. If we don't think it's important, he's not going to put it on his list of to-dos. What's your thought on that? Are we seeing these church closings as animosity that's being ratcheted up, in part because they can get sanctions relief pursuant to the 5 benchmarks without human rights or religious freedom?
Well, certainly, I don't think that it would be outside of reasonable consideration to suggest that if these particular ideals were left off of such a list, then there would be no consequences, as it were, for violating in this particular arena. I would say as well, one of the things that we've been adamant about, I know other colleagues, panelists have been adamant about as well, is trying to articulate why this particular ideal ought be considered in foreign policy objectives. And it's been a slow-going process of trying to help individuals understand philosophically why this is such a pertinent issue. And so are encouraged that this is beginning to be a part of the dialogue, and hopeful that it is taken seriously in policy considered ahead.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sykes.
Thanks very much, Chair. I wanted to respond to your question about the China NGO law, which, as you mentioned, restricts foreign funding and the independence of the sector, and also highlight a tool at the disposal of the United States that has and can be used to great effect and requires very little investment. That tool is the Lifeline Fund for embattled civil society organizations. This is a fund that is funded by a coalition of governments, including the U.S. State Department, and has been used in a number of countries worldwide to respond to emergency situations. And the example that I'd like to highlight is actually in Congo, Brazzaville. As we've heard, there are horrible restrictions on press, on civil society. This is a government that is not, in general, a rights-respecting government, but even in a context like that, we can have impact with relatively small investment. In 2015, there was a draft associations bill introduced in Congo that was not dissimilar from the bill in China. It limited foreign funding, it limited independence of the sector. In response to that bill, a small Lifeline grant, about less than $20,000 US, was given to a consortium of organizations in Congo. ICNL provided them with legal analysis based on international norms and best practices, and they created an advocacy coalition, a broad-based advocacy coalition that included human rights groups, development groups, groups working on healthcare, groups working on freedom of expression, and they came together to advocate directly with parliamentarians in their country. I know, as we mentioned, the utility of Americans telling folks what to do and to respect rights is limited, but when people speak to their governments in a coordinated and informed way, they can have impact, even in contexts like Congo-Brazzaville. Eventually, that coalition, through months of effort, convinced their parliamentarians that this bill was a bad idea, that it would have negative impact on their constituents in local language, and that bill was eventually withdrawn. So, of course, it didn't fix every problem in Congo-Brazzaville, but you can have impact using specific tools like the Lifeline Consortium Fund. Unfortunately, a new bill is now pending, so we're hoping to continue to support that advocacy coalition to respond to continuing threats. Thanks.
Mr. Prendergast, let me ask you first. Are you aware of any actions in other countries pursuing network sanctions on individuals in the countries that you've talked about and described?
I think they're playing catch up. I've spent some time in a number of European capitals, as have my colleagues, basically preaching a bit and educating about the limits of the current sanctions approaches. The Brits are probably the furthest along and they've made some quite substantial progress in the last 6 months on a number of issues related to financial transparency and, as most of you know, and on the sanctions stuff. So I think we're going to see much more lockstep on the network side of things when the U.S. moves, the Brits at least. But of course, it's always a struggle with a number of the other countries on the European continent. So we're focusing primarily on Germany and France as potential leaders in understanding this, but it's a hard slog. And I guess the reason why we, after having worked in government for a number of years and then watched successive administrations after my time in government have so much trouble building these international coalitions for second and third tier issues, perceived second and third tier issues, we wanted to look at tools, U.S. government tools, that when they are used unilaterally, A, other governments can come along later and support, and B, in and of themselves, they can have an impact. And because of this issue of the U.S. dollar dominating international commercial transactions, the U.S. Treasury Department has a wildly outsized influence when it comes to influencing these governments when they use anti-money laundering measures. And all this infrastructure, this architecture was built up after 9/11 in the aftermath of the attacks. And so we now have global instruments for restricting the movement of illicit financing that the banks comply with, because if they don't, there are massive billions and billions of dollars of fines. So when you bring to the attention, so it's not just the governments. This is what I guess I'm coming in for a landing here. What's more important to us at this point is engaging in and involving the international banks in whatever sanctions regimes, network sanctions regimes, and money laundering efforts we're undertaking. Because if they have evidence, they can just move themselves. It doesn't matter what other governments are, because they don't want to have these horrific fines, because whenever there's an opening in the international financial banking system, when one of these, which we just published a report last week on a Congolese bank that had opened up its floodgates to allowing corrupt actors to launder their money through that bank. Well, guess who follows right away? Terrorist groups. Well, breach in the system. Nobody's complying with the international legal framework. Let's go in, and we found evidence of, in this case, Hezbollah coming in right after the Kabila regime's illicit financial activity. And so the banks don't want anything to do with that. And so these small regional banks all over Africa, in order to trade in U.S. dollars, in order to do business in U.S. dollars, have to create these relationships called correspondent banking relationships with the banks in the United States, with the big global banks and in Europe. So they have to comply with these. Once they are alerted to money laundering occurring within their system, they have to take action on it. That's, to me, the key, more than the old coalition building we'd go around and with our, trying to get these Europeans to do this and that. But the global banks are the key on this kind of stuff.
Thank you. And Ms. Talani, I had a question for you. Your organization does important work rehabilitating victims of torture that have found their way to the United States, including through refugee and asylum mechanisms. Let me ask you, how have the President's limits on U.S. intake of refugees affected those fleeing oppression in Sub-Saharan Africa?
We could get one of our lawyers to answer that question. Could we do that?
If the chairman is agreeable, sure.
Without objection, it'll be done.
We'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay, sure. I yield back.
Thank you. If I could, I actually wrote the Torture Victims Relief Act, which established torture victims relief centers in the United States. I've done 4 laws on that, and we do have a very robust effort. We have in excess of 500,000 people in the United States who came here as asylum seekers who had been tortured and degraded pursuant to the terms of the Convention Against Torture. And obviously, the scars they carry are often PTSD. The physical ones may heal, but the psychological scars often go unattended, and that is globally as well. I'm wondering if you could, Ms. Talani, or anyone else who might want to speak to it, have people utilized those centers, either here in the United States, particularly some of the emigres, but overseas, we also support them there as well. We also support the UN Voluntary Fund for Torture, which also establishes these centers. They are an amazing resource for rehabilitation of someone who is walking with nightmares, can't sleep, sitting where you are. Well, as we prepared the first bill, we heard from one person after another who had been tortured, and they all had the same, they couldn't sleep. They had nightmares. They wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning in a confined situation that they had lived through, and as journalists, certainly beatings, all of that, carries with it a psychological consequence. Have any of them utilized those centers or the best practices that they utilize?
Yes, myself, I use them with tasks because even though I'm in the US, sometimes I don't feel safe. If my roommate is not home, it's always like something is coming in the house, so I have to lock myself in my room. So at task, I have a psychological counseling. So we have like punctual meetings. So if I want you to talk about something, I saw him. And also, you can see in my long report, I mentioned a lot of things. Back home, I couldn't talk about those things. So if even today I can stand here speaking with you, it's thanks because I got that psychological support. If I didn't get it, I wouldn't be here talking with you. I couldn't. But with some new policies here, some asylum seekers, sometimes we're afraid. We consider the US being really a land of freedom, which can give us security. But sometimes we don't feel safe, and some asylum seekers, they don't feel safe. Maybe the government will pressure the US government to take us back home or this. But we still have hope that the US government is able to save us. But task is really helpful to us. It's giving a tremendous support to us. It not only helps us on the psychological side, but also for many of us to find a job. Because, when you leave your country and you come to the US, English is not your first language. For many people, they don't even speak English. So finding a job, it's very hard. And task is helping a lot of people on that too.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to Mr. Garrett. I just known parenthetically that Congressman Garrett actually represents the area where Thomas Jefferson 2 centuries ago lived. And it was Jefferson who said, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter. So I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Garrett.
There's nothing like getting called away and coming back in and immediately having your name called. I want to apologize to you all on the panel sincerely for being in and out of the room. The challenge I think that I most lament is the degree of bandwidth required to try to effectively function here. But I want to thank you all for being here and tell you that these are the sort of hearings that I really love and live for. As a first-year member, the frustration as it relates to the difficulty of passing legislation is beyond anything I could comprehend in advance. Having said that, as a member of this committee and specifically this subcommittee, I've sort of found a reason for being. Thomas Jefferson also said that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and it's been probably the pinnacle of my achievement in my limited time here to have traveled on an unsanctioned trip to the Republic of the Sudan to secure the release of two gentlemen, Pastor Hassan and Pastor or Seminarian Abdul Manamam, as well as 7 family members, and ultimately secure refugee status for them in this country, which allowed me the opportunity to cross paths with some amazing folks, the people at Jubilee, Middle East Concern, VOM, a young lady named Courtney Gates who works religious freedom missions issues at the U.S. mission in Sudan, who's remarkable. And having had the opportunity as well to have dinner with the former head of NIS, Mohammed Atta, which is an interesting name, as well as having dined in the home of Ibrahim Ahmed Omer, who's the Speaker of the Assembly. And the reason I started with the Jefferson quote that sunlight's the best disinfectant is while everything you say as it relates to the human rights record of Omar al-Bashir is absolutely and unequivocally true, and having heard particularly you, Mr. Harris, mention the destruction of churches, being able to say that I've actually been to a couple of those churches and met with some of the religious leaders, I think the Sudanese and many other nations tend to behave better when they know that the United States is actually looking and gives a darn. And it's interesting from a political standpoint to hear from people who generally tend to agree with me, who lament our engagement in foreign affairs and international aid, et cetera, as something that's not fiscally prudent, because nothing in life is linear, ultimately, and you never reap your harvest when you sow your proverbial crop. And I think it was Mattis who said we can either invest money in foreign aid or in bullets and bombs, and having worn the uniform of the United States military, I can assure you I'd much rather help individuals prosper and have self-determination than send young men and women, whether American or foreign nationals, into harm's way. It should always be a last resort. And so I believe in everything you speak about today, and I'm encouraged candidly by the 2016 actions to extend Magnitsky to a global scale. I think that it's an amazing, and I'm not just going to soliloquy, but it'll be mostly that because I'm in a hurry, y'all are in a hurry, and but there's going to be an imploration/request at the end. But it's an amazing new tool, and if we can empower the entities in this country to do their jobs with Magnitsky, with FinCEN, et cetera, I think we really can move the proverbial needle. Having said that, as I said when I came in, I'll come full circle. In order to have a PhD, you have to know everything about something. In order to effectively serve in this body, you have to know something about everything, right? Literally, at some point today, I'll cover K-12 ed, we'll do higher ed, we'll talk about healthcare, literally I have today. Iran obviously is in the news, et cetera. But folks like yourselves can tell stories to us. And those stories can help us understand what's going on, and by understanding what's going on, then we can impact a difference. I'll speak to this by way of breaking my arm, patting myself on the back. With the Sudanese, as a freshman member, we got engaged with a number of other members, I believe to include Chairman Smith, in an effort to help secure the release of a Czech national, Pastor Yashik, who was aided by these two gentlemen, Pastor Hassan and Abdul Manamam, from the Sudan. The Sudanese had worked with the Chinese a number of years, really as a result of the draconian sanctions that we placed upon that nation in the 90s, and their rail infrastructure had broken down, and they wanted to work with the Americans because the Chinese couldn't fix it. So what we identified was an arena wherein we had something they wanted, and that was really the technical expertise of engineers at General Electric, of all things, right? And so where we are able to identify areas that are essentially soft spots and impact positive change as it relates to the arena of global human rights, we should do it. Having said that, yet much remains to be done, and I'm asking if each of you would kindly consider reaching out to Trip Grant from our staff after this meeting concludes with your contact information, and I'm going to have Tripp come down and if you have time to stay, share his contact information, and if you can get by our office, I'd love to have you over and listen. And the reason is simple. There are two foreign aid paradigms in the world. There is the U.S. foreign aid paradigm, which largely seeks to give money to human beings and empower human beings to empower themselves, whether it's programs to help women start venture enterprise, wherein women involved in the economy and the education realm creates a world where radicalization is less prevalent and expands opportunity really across the population, or whether it's simply food. When I was a soldier deployed in the Balkans, every candy bar I got, which we didn't get candy bars, but every pack of Charms, every pack of M&Ms I got out of my MREs went to a local national child, because my feeling was that their interaction with the United States would be that somebody gave them some M&Ms that they would have never gotten otherwise, and maybe when that young person, and they're all now in their 30s, which scares me, thought about the United States down the road, they'd have a positive memory. But there's value there. That's our paradigm, and it works in societies where people are free to have self-determination. That's what people want. They want help, they want care. The Chinese paradigm is give money to the autocrats and the kleptocrats. Build soccer stadiums, build presidential palaces. I've personally witnessed a presidential palace that probably rivals the Cannon House office building in size, that was paid for entirely by the Chinese government. And ours is better than theirs as long as people can have some sort of self-determination, but ultimately they never will. If you look at the foundations of civil society, the Bill of Rights prioritizes the First Amendment first. Speech, assembly, religion, and then understanding in the religion context, the Establishment Clause shall make no law establishing a religion nor prohibiting the free practice thereof. We cannot, at a barrel of a gun or by shaking our hands in a hegemonic manner, foist American values onto the world, but what we can and should do is say to the world, we will do business with people who share the basic modicum of our values. And if we do that and we mean it, and I say that with emphasis because we've had paradigms, the Iran Sanctions Act of the 90s, wherein we turned a blind eye while people undercut the sanctions, because why money? And when you put money ahead of human life, then don't be surprised when bad things continue to happen. But if we do that, we can beget good. So here's the imploration, and again, I apologize for the rambling. Please come to us and let us know what we don't know. Let us know where, and specifically Mr. Harris, as it relates to the Sudan, the things that are going on that we might have missed, because there's a lot of other stuff going on, so that we can reach out and exploit in a positive manner the relationships we've established with people who are sure not perfect, but who I think if they know we're paying attention might be able to be nudged in the right direction. And please let us know where there are opportunities that we can advocate on behalf of a better world for human beings within the purview of the role of the United States government, which again is not to be dictatorial, but we should promulgate policy that helps people who help people. So I thank you, and again, I apologize for the nature of this. I'm running around like every day, but genuinely apologize for being in and out, and I appreciate what you all do, and please stay long enough for us to exchange contact information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to thank our distinguished witnesses for your leadership, your commitment. You inspire, and you've given us a lot to act upon, and I thank you for that. If there's anything you'd like to add before we go, or in the hearing? Okay, then this hearing is adjourned, and I thank you so very much.